Hello students, this is Dr. Faizan Mirza. We are discussing mechanics of breathing, and the content that I want to cover today includes the pressure volume curve, compliance abnormalities regarding compliance, the role of surfactant in compliance, airway resistance and airflows, and the work of breathing. So starting off our discussion with pressure volume curve. The pressure volume curve can be drawn for a lung and it shows inflation and deflation. This x-axis shows to you the pressure around lung which is being increased gradually, and the y-axis shows to you the volume as it increases. You can see the graph shows you that inflation takes a different route and the curve for deflation in which the lungs are recoiling follows a different route. So this is about stretching of the lung. This stretching occurs because the gas is going inside the lungs and the lungs are expanding, and this return is because of the elastic recoil because the gases are then going out. The model which is used for explaining this kind of graph, because the inflation and deflation curve is not following the same pattern. The inflation curve goes up, the deflation curve should have followed the very same trajectory in a normal case. But in case of lungs, the elastic recoil and stretching is different. So inflation and deflation curves do not overlap, and this is called as hysteresis. Now, if we try to understand this using a model, so here this bag represents lung. This is an airtight jar here with a pump attached, and and you can see this is a gas tube is connected to a beaker having water, and a jar is inverted on it. This is air present inside it. Because of the movement of air inside this dome region, this particular dome can either rise up or it can fall down, and these two pulley will allow this string to move, which will cause the stylus attached here to start moving up and down. The graph which is plotted for inflation and deflation is plotted using this particular apparatus, in which the pump is used to provide pressure around the lungs and then allowing the pump to retract all the air that was sent in this bag. So here we see that when air is pumped into this tube, from here the air will go inside, and as the air fills up into this jar, air will start to push this lung tissue and it will start to contract. It will squeeze and it will push out the air into this tube. The tube allow the air to move into this dome shaped region, and this dome shaped structure starts to move up. When it starts to move up, the string attached to it goes ahead as well along these pulley, and the stylus or the pen which is present here, it will start to ink the graph by moving downwards. When the same experiment is repeated by pulling the air out, I am using red arrows to represent this. So when the air is pulled out, the air from outside this lung tissue is pulled out. The lung tissue will start to stretch. When it starts to stretch, this pulls the air back from this dome shaped region into the gas tube and into this lung, because the pressure around this region is decreasing. As a result, it's essentially pulling the air. The air is being pulled here. So the pulley starts to move in a reverse manner, and the pen which is actually drawing the graph here, it starts to move up. So this curve when drawn, this actually shows you how the pressure difference is present inside and outside the lungs. So this pressure difference is there inside the lung and outside the lung, and this pressure difference called as a transpulmonary pressure. I already discussed with you what hysteresis is, that inhalation and deflation curves are different. They do not follow the same trajectory. Another feature is for hysteresis is that if you note down for any given pressure here, the volume in lung is larger in deflation. For example, at -10, if I want to look at the volume of -10 pressure, I see that the inflation curves tell me that the volume is 0.5 liter. But for -10 pressure, if I go to the deflation curve, I see that the volume is much larger. This is almost 0.75 liter. So this is what hysteresis is doing. which is the feature of this curve here, the pressure volume curve. Compliance. When we're discussing compliance actually, when we take the slope of the pressure volume curve, we get compliance. We already have covered what the pressure volume curve is. Compliance basically refers to distensibility. More compliant means easy to distend. So at normal ranges, we see that the slope is very steep, which means that the lung is more compliant and it is easy to distend. The lung becomes more stiff or less compliant at high expanding pressure, which can be seen by the flattening of the slope. So you can just go back and see that here the curve has flattened out, which means this is less compliant, whereas the steep curve represents that the lung tissue is very well compliant. Compliance in the lungs is used for assessing abnormalities as well. Conditions such as emphysema or physiological aging process, it increases compliance of the lungs, which makes it more distensible. Whereas conditions such as fibrosis or alveolar edema, they reduce the compliance of lungs. Compliance is an outcome of the surfactant which is produced inside the alveoli. This is basically a phospholipid molecule which is diapalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. The surfactant reduces the surface tension. Reduction in surface tension actually increases the compliance. Surfactant is also abbreviated as DPPC. The role of surfactant is not just reducing the surface tension, but also it stabilizes alveoli. It reduces the work expanding in each breath because the lungs are compliant and easy to expand. It also prevents transudation of the fluid, which is leaking out of the fluid from the capillary, and it keeps the alveoli dry. Surfactants are produced by type 2 cells, epithelial cells of the alveoli. Mechanics of breathing also shows to us how different flows can occur inside our airways. This shows to you the laminar flow. Laminar flow shows to you that all the air, you can say the gas molecules, are traveling in parallel straight lines. This is called laminar flow. This is turbulent flow. You can see eddy currents have formed. This circular movement of, or you can say chaotic movement, or this radial movement of these arrows show to you that this is turbulent flow. Wherever there is turbulent flow, this is called as eddy formation at branches. This occurs at branching, wherever the branching occurs inside the respiratory system. Gradually it becomes turbulent. Transitional actually shows you how the laminar flow is laminar when the branch is there, and it stays laminar, but the air striking with the edge of the dichotomous branched region, it goes back slightly and then becomes parallel to the laminar flow. So this is transitional. So we see these three type of flows when we are discussing airflow. Airway resistance refers to the basically how much resistance is there in your airways, and the contraction of smooth muscles in the bronchioles, this cause airway constriction. This can be stimulated by vagus nerve. It can also be stimulated by cigarette smoke. B2 adrenoceptors basically are involved in relaxing the smooth muscles of the bronchi. So the effects of vagus nerve and cigarette smoke in constricting airways can be reverted by the use of beta 2 adrenoceptor agonist, which can stimulate the beta 2 receptors, so the airway constriction can be released. Similarly, parasympathetic activity can also lead to airway constriction by the release of acetylcholine. When we are discussing work of breathing, the work required to move the lung and the chest wall can be calculated by multiplying pressure with volume. When we are discussing work done on the lungs, this graph actually shows to you work done on the lungs, intrapleural pressure versus volume above FRC. FRC is functional residual capacity. So this graph is drawn, And this line from A till B till C represents inspiration, and the region A, F, C, E, and A, again basically this shows to you expiration. So this is inspiration and this is expiration, and the line this line which is AEC, it separates the inspiration from expiration. So if this is the origin of the graph and this point at the top is D, so we can find out various areas in this particular diagram. For example, ABC, the line ABC represents intrapleural pressure. OABCDO, which means this is O, this is A, then B, then C, then D, and then O again. This entire region represents work done on lung. Whereas OAECDO, which is OAECDO, this region is actually the work required to overcome the elastic forces. So we have subtracted this region from there. So that's the work required to overcome the elastic forces. AECFA, which is this is A, E, C, F, and A. This region is the work required to overcome the airway resistance and the tissue resistance in the lungs. OAECDO, this OAECDO again, this is again overcoming elastic forces, which I already have discussed here. Why I'm mentioning here? Because this area is proportional to tidal volume, and it is because of the passive recoil of the lungs. Area ABCA, A, B, C, E, and then A. This is the area which actually shows overcoming airway resistance, and it is proportional to the breathing rate. So what's proportional to tidal volume and what's proportional to breathing rate actually determines how much work is done in breathing on the lung, in expanding the chest wall and the lungs as well. So this region which I have just shaded pink, actually the one which is proportional to tidal volume, and the one that I have just shaded green is the one which is proportional to the breathing rate. When we are discussing total work of breathing, the efficiency of lungs, so efficiency percent can be calculated for lungs with using a formula, which is efficiency percent is equal to useful work divided by total energy expended, which is the oxygen cost, multiplied by 100%. That's it from my side. This ends the topic of mechanics of breathing. Thank you so much.